Hi all, welcome to our second installment of the game design. This week we're going to start talking about starting the process a little more. Last week we talked about kind of the cores of game design, and this week we're going to carry that on a little bit more, talk a little bit more about mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, and also just kind of look at other kind of basic processes of game design. So what do we do when you want to start designing a game? And there's different types of games to start. Obviously, football game, you have like a kind of a kickoff. I mean, I guess that's when the game starts. See, there's lots of prep work and things behind that, picking the right players and designing a strategy. So there's many ideas of things you think of before the actual start of a game. Same thing with game design. A player starting is so much different than when a game designer starts a game. There's an enormous amount of work. It's almost laughable the amount of work that goes involved to designing a game just before that player even hits start. So think about that when you are playing your own games and you're starting your own games. Think about what is the actual start of the game, and then where do designers begin when they start working with their games. So. The agenda this week is to kind of talk about in a little more depth mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, and then kind of put them all together in this in the topic of MDA. Again, I started talking about it last week, but we're going to talk about it more this week and kind of how those three terms go together to influence game design. We're also going to kind of talk about story and characters and goals, and then maybe some additional points, and then I'll have our references and conclusion for today. So that's the goals of the week's lecture. To start out, we're going to talk about mechanics. Different sources kind of describe, like I said last week, mechanics and dynamics are hard kind of terms to get your head around at some points, because a lot of the definitions and ideas overlap with not just each other, but with like other concepts like themes or action, the different actions and things. So as a review, I kind of, last week we talked about mechanics are the way like players interact with the game. This week, Shell from 2008, kind of game design theorist says, that mechanics are all that a game is when everything else is taken and stripped away. So if we think about that, like everything else is gone, this is the way we interact with the game. It's the skeletons of the game kind of without any other overlaid elements like the storyline or what it looks like or maybe the tone of the game. This is like fundamentally what is left and how a player can um, interact with the game. It's again, it's hard to define many times because the definitions are broad and different. Um, Sometimes the mechanics are kind of like these very objective, clearly stated rules. There's also this idea of kind of what mechanics mean in general. Um, just to kind of pull in a couple definitions, and we just saw that you know, uh, mechanics have been described as kind of these um, very objective, clearly stated set of rules, what's left when everything is stripped away. You can also think of mechanics as the elements of the game themselves, as a kind of here's a definition. These are generally defined as the rules of the game. These may be formal rules, such as a player cannot move his king onto a check, into check, or rules about the features of a game, like the properties in Monopoly have the names of places in Atlantic City. For mechanics alone, someone would be able to kind of reconstruct a game as like how to play it, but not necessarily, yeah, like the characters and the theme and things, but you can kind of tell what a character can do based on the mechanics, but we have to be clear, mechanics aren't necessarily the rules. It's just the rules kind of help describe the mechanics. So yeah, lots of different definitions. Another definition says that mechanics are the various actions, behaviors, and control mechanisms afforded to the player within a game context. Together with the game's content, um, the levels, assessments, and so on. The mechanics support overall gameplay dynamics. Shell is going to provide one classification method that puts mechanics into 7 categories: space, time, objects and attributes, or sorry, object attributes and states, actions, rules, skill, and chance. So hopefully, looking a little deeper at these elements can kind of help you, tease out the differences in what dynamics are, sorry, mechanics are. So Shell's classifications kind of help us break in the different types of mechanics that possibly exist. And your goal is to listen to these and think, I would say, as abstractly as you can, because space and time, it can refer to a lot of different things. And it might be good to kind of listen to how I describe this and also go back and read this as well, because they're kind of, concepts you might want to refer back to and kind of think about and digest. But space, if we're thinking about how a player interacts with a game involving space, that can, all games take place in kind of this magical circle where we have the rules and the constraints and how what we're doing in this space, there's rhetorical certain rhetorical moves of us. We act in a certain way, we talk in a certain way, we have expectations set that this is a game, and we're no longer really engaging in quote unquote real life at this point. We're playing a game. So this is this magic circle that you have, and you look at the space by kind of stripping away all surface elements like visuals or feelings to see what boundaries of the space are within a game. And space looks different in all different types of games. So, if you're doing 20 questions, you can kind of think that this 20 questions has 0 space, and that, there might not be a board, there might not be, an actual set of questions in your hand. The game exists kind of in your mind and in the mind of the other player, and you have this real magic circle that's existing, and you've both agreed to, engage in this game, but there might not be this physical space. You kind of have the 0 space. So it exists, but you just can't see it. But a video game might have 2D or 3D space where character travels, or also, space in like a digital game or something can actually, you can think about, oh, this is the inside of or my player plays on the inside and then he goes outside, and both of these worlds or spaces can have different expectations of what you can and can't do, but that they do exist in different spaces. So thinking about the space that you have and how players interact with it and where the game boundaries are is a way to think of space when you're thinking about mechanics. So the next one, time. There's so many dimensions of time, and how we can manipulate time, or how we can think about time involving dynamics. So in real life, you can't really control time. I mean, if I would time travel to the future and have a floating car or something like that. That's my grandma voice. I should stop doing my grandma voice. But we can't control time like that in real life. But time is an important thing to manipulate for games, or to keep track of, or a way to change the player's experience when they deal with games. So examples of time mechanics are like discrete time. Sometimes time isn't connected in a game, and we have to think about how players have to wait their turns to continue the game. So if you're doing a board game or maybe a turn-based game, a player plays a certain amount of time, they stop, they wait for the next person to go, then they play again. So while the game space takes a certain amount of time, the player's experience in that space, or the interaction is kind of starts and ends. They might be looking to see what the other player does and kind of still thinking of strategy, but their ability to interact with the game is limited during those times as well. So sometimes we have discrete time. Also, sometimes we have continuous time, in that as we advance in a game, like sometimes we can stop a clock with like a timeout or something like that, but we also are expecting to keep going in a game in a certain amount of time. Soccer, chess, football, the baseball, these are expected or more baseball, not necessarily in the same amount of time. Baseball is innings, but football we're set in a matter of time, and basketball too. While the timeouts might turn a 2-hour game into a 4-hour game. Other games, stick more strictly to the time constraints of the game, and how long it's supposed to be played. I remember the first soccer game I watched, I was like, what? It's already over? Where are all the timeouts? But anyway, so time, continuous time is another element of the way people can interact with games. Clocks, sometimes we set clocks in games so that when a timer runs out, the game is over, or your turn is over. So clocks can be one real way. Just looking at the little sand timer there, we can think about how, sometimes we say you have 15 seconds to create a word, and when that 15 seconds is up, your person's run out. But also sometimes, clocks aren't the only way. Sometimes we also have, the goal is just to beat the other player. So, in a race, you might want the fastest time and, really beat, but there isn't necessarily a clock shown. As long as you beat the other person, that's when the game is over. So there is this time element, but it's not like a clock where it says, you have all this time to complete the task. What you're doing is just trying to complete something in the fastest amount of time. Another way to interact with time elements in a game, as far as the mechanics, are like controlling time, especially like a more digital game. You can speed up time to advance goals. I play a lot of city builders. Sometimes I speed up the game so that it like goes faster and my city populates, or I build something faster. I'm sure in games you play, you've kind of manipulated with time in ways that you can't do in real life, so to speak. So if the goal of your game is to create an experience that players enjoy and like, you have to get the pacing right. So, you don't want your game to lag on too long so that players get bored, but you also don't want, to speed up your game too quickly so players feel overwhelmed or not enjoying the experience. So objects, attributes, and space. So I think you can think of these, I guess, as nouns, and sometimes this gets tricky because you think, I know what a noun is, and then it's more complicated. But space needs things in it, and time needs things to control. So objects are the things in your game that are the nouns or the mechanics. Object's state of being can be described through both attribute and state. An attribute is a category of information about an object, and a state is a condition about the attribute. Let me give you an example in a second. But objects have one or more attributes, and an object is often only at one position. So for instance, we can have speed. So speed can be this noun because it's like the state, like I have speed. And you can have a maximum speed, and then you can also have a current speed. So the maximum speed might not vary much, but the current speed is more dynamic and can fluctuate. So it can have this speed is kind of this condition that you have, but yeah, like your current speed, like you have like this maximum and minimum. Anyway, so think about how like objects and attributes and states. So what is the object, kind of what can it do, and what is the current state at what it's in. So this one to me is kind of tricky because you have to kind of stop and break things down, and it's hard to discuss about this unless I give you a million examples, and if I give you a million examples, this is going to be really long. So my recommendation to you is to think about objects and attributes and states, and do some personal research on your own. That is my encouragement to you all about this element. So actions are the verb of a game, and they answer what players do. These are often things equated with mechanics. So I think like speed's an action, but in this case speed was an object that a state of being, and what you have the speed. But anyway, actions are the base movements a player can make. Think about how a person can move forward or jump, or how a king can move backward in chess. It has to do with the actions you make, and I think these are, in my head, these are like the more identifiably mechanical things that you can think about when you think about game and how a player can interact. If you're thinking about or strategic actions that a player can make, kind of relate to the big picture of a game and how players use basic actions to achieve these larger goals. So if a player is engaging in a strategic action, they're trying to think about, you know, the game's goals and how to manipulate whatever object or thing that you're using in order to reach those goals. Also realize that, you know, games often look similar, and when everything else is stripped away based on these actions, like, you know, a lot of game characters can jump, and a lot of them can go forward, and a lot of things swim, or, you know, like the actions are kind of like basic and kind of reflect a lot of underscoring game to yourself, or not to yourself. The actions are kind of quintessential games and activities, and what happens is you kind of start using these mechanics of the actions involving space, involving time, involving kind of the limitations and the states that they're currently at to kind of create this different playing experience. And I would say that, you know, we put all these space and time and objects and actions and rules and skills and chance all together, and then that's when, in my opinion, we get the dynamics of a game, but we'll get there. So anyway, Shell recommends, you know, asking yourself about your game, you know, what are the basic actions of my game? What are the strategic actions people are doing, and what would I like to see? How can I make the actions that I'm doing based off this strategy? And I would say that you want your actions to be strategic, in that you want, like we talked about last week, good games are meaningful, or have meaningful decisions. So you want the actions that you do to be meaningful for the overall goals of the game. We're going to talk about strategies and tactics at one point in this semester, but, you know, strategies are kind of the overall big picture, while tactics are kind of the little mini events that, or mini things that you get you to the strategy. So anyway, strategy, you want your actions meaningful is probably what I should say, you know. And, you know, while basic actions that, you know, a player does that aren't necessarily meaningful could be useful in a game, but you want a good ratio between the player doing something just for the heck of it versus like a player doing something that contributes to the overall goals of the game. Rules are the fundamental mechanics that define space, time, objects, actions, and consequences. You know, they tie everything together and give the game a goal. So rules are part of the mechanics. You can have these operational rules, where rules define what a player can do in a game. You can do foundational rules. These are kind of more theoretical rules, where you know, if an operational rule says you need to roll a dice to advance in the game, a foundational rule is more abstract and describes the motivations, like, you know, you're able to advance up to 6 places based on a standard dice. So they kind of play in together to say, like, not only what they do and what you can do, but kind of why and what in the bigger picture are these rules doing. So there's also behavioral rules that govern behavior of what players can do and how they interact with the game, and also like the ideas of like good sportsmanship. So, you know, like you don't, you know, maybe there's no rules against sabotaging a player, but particularly, but, you know, there might be these kind of unstated rules. So not all games necessarily have all these, and they don't have them necessarily in a rule book, but I'm trying to give you kind of examples of ideas of what rules like constrain or encourage a player to act certain ways to interact with a game. So there might be behavioral rules, like you don't do this because you know other people don't like it when people do that. Like if you're playing like a shooter and it's like you don't want like people don't like it when snipers just come and or you just hide and snipe, do sniping. Is that how you say it? You don't just hide. You know, you want to, like, the community wants you to go out and engage and not just stealthily hide behind a bush and kill people or kill your other players. You want the players to engage and run around and do things. So anyway, that might be behavioral rules that you might know about a community. Written rules are the ones that are part of documentation and describe the operational rules. Like this is what's said in in the game. Um, and you could say the difference between operational and written rules is that this is literally written. Sometimes operational videos or rules can come in the form of videos or tutorials or something like mini games on how to play something, but sometimes the rule is that a particular way. Laws are also a type of rules. These apply to tournaments or other games. These are other types of rules. And then you have official rules, maybe or social situations where, in chess, a player has to say check. Maybe it's not necessarily written into a rule book, but everyone considers this the official rule in a particular tournament or something like that. And there's also might be house rules, where rules are formed by a group of people. Maybe you're going to a bar and you're going to do a trivia game and they have house rules or something like that. So they kind of spell out what in this particular situation you're able to do. What else? There's lots of, if you look at the notes, I'll have a lot of different types of rules, but I don't necessarily think that these are useful at this point. So, but good games need concrete rules, achievable goals, and need to be rewarding, have set up rewarding situations. So, skill mechanics are the abilities of the player to carry out pieces of the game. Skills can be, physical strength like dexterity, coordination, endurance, ability to use and manipulate the controller. Skill can be mental skills that involve memory, observation, problem solving, decision making. They could be social skills like how to cooperate, how to sabotage someone else. So it's useful to think about the different types of skills that require, and we'll talk about Twitch games that kind of need dexterity or chance-based games that don't really have as much skill involved, or strategic skills. We'll talk about skills in depth in this course, and it's also useful to think about what skills your game is representing. Are they representing real skills where people really need the ability to do something quickly or have the physical strength to do something, or is it like digital skills where you're like really good at nunchucks or something like that. Maybe you're not really good at nunchucks in the real life, but you have these virtual skills that are good on paper or in digital worlds. And then chance mechanics have to deal with the mechanics of space, time, objects, skills, and rules, but in a more surprising and serendipitous way. Chance, and we're going to talk extensively about chance later on, is kind of how it's actually very mathematical, and you have to make sure that especially for like digital games or even board games, you have to make sure your math lines up. If you're saying that we're going to make this a chance element and the probability of you drawing X card is 50%, if somebody keeps getting sent back to the tar pit in Candyland, or the licorice pit, I think is what it was, over and over again, they might not think it's fun. So you have to get the mathematical chance probabilities right. You have to figure out how to estimate chance, how to make sure that skills have a proper probability of success. You have to estimate your audience's ability to have a certain skill and be able to tolerate elements of chance. Be able to predict and think about how predicting pure chance is also kind of an imagined skill. Sometimes people think that they can start predicting chance. If you look into like quantum numbers as well, a lot of times, a computer generated random number is never going to be random because it's still built on kind of mathematical principles. So you'd have to have like a quantum random number to be really random. But anyway, so just don't make a predictable pattern of chance as well, is kind of what I was thinking. So Shell recommends asking yourself when you're thinking about chance, is your game really random, or are there parts that just feel random? Does the randomness give players positive feelings, or does it give them a feeling of like negative feelings of hopelessness or lack of control? So if you're doing a really strategic game, think it later on, we'll talk about bowling. If somebody's really good at bowling and you throw in a bunch of chance elements, like, I don't know, like giant bunny will run across the alley when the bowlers in a bowl, you know, like they might get irritated and might not like that chance element because, or the way they're interacting with the game, because they want to show off their skills. They don't want a giant bunny to come thwart their ball and throw it and kick it in the gutter or something like that. So, so just think about how you use chance and how players interact with the game. So hopefully these like just simple mechanic categories will help you see what it means to have to deal with mechanics in a particular game. And on that note, I'd like to do a quick polling question. You know, of the list of sampled mechanic categories discussed, what do you think is the easiest category to understand, and you know, what would be the most difficult category for you to understand? Just interested in knowing. So our next section is going to be dynamics. We'll move on from mechanics. And again, different definitions will come up with different things, but we can see that dynamics are what happens between all the mechanics and the larger systems of the game. So you know, the mechanics and the various mechanics and ways we can go about things kind of work in together and create this dynamic of the game, and especially, you know, the context which the game is going into and who's playing it. There's so many different things that kind of involve the dynamics. Highwiller in 2020 goes further and defines dynamics as, you know, the runtime behaviors of a game that come between what is supposed to happen in a game, kind of maybe the rules, and then based on rules and expectations and what does happen, and then interactions between the mechanics and the player. So an illustration kind of quote is, you know, when the players interact with the rules, what happens? In chess, you know, to sacrifice relatively worthless pawns to capture the powerful opponent's queen, yet nowhere in the rules does the player said to do should do that. So this behavior kind of emerges from the rules. So it becomes a dynamic that comes between the interplay from the rules, what you can do, what you should do, and the objectives of the game. So, and Castilla also defines dynamics as the patterns of player decision making that can be expressed as the general emotional behavior. So then that starts getting us a behavior and effect, going to move us to aesthetics as well, but also you think about dynamics are the behaviors of the interplay between different types of what rules and mechanics and actions and things. So I would also like to say, yeah, that you know, that kind of dynamics is that more of the sum of the whole parts kind of thing, and the system level rather than maybe the more specific actions that can be done a smaller time. We also have different categories of dynamics. You can have metagame dynamics, which are the metagame is the game that's occurring outside of the explicit system described by the rules. Usually these are social interactions between players. You know, you can negotiate, you can have form fragile alliances, you can kind of do bluffs or things kind of like these little outside the game actions, I guess you could say, or, you know, kind of like team dynamics too. What's happening. Retrograde dynamics are, if a dynamic is retrograde, then it's working against the experience that the designers intended for the players of the game. You know, spawn camping is a good idea of retrograde dynamic. Another might be caused, there might be an encouragement where, you know, in a World War II serious game, you can, the way that the mechanics kind of are formulated or allowed, you can encourage players to jump constantly because it's harder to hit while doing so. So that would be like a dynamic that emerges from the mechanics that isn't necessarily intended by the designers. So, you know, you can have the dynamics that kind of occurred within the game, and also these kind of meta game or retrograde dynamics as well. Next useful conversation is to kind of think about some types of dynamics that are also found in games. There's the idea of turtling. You know, if a player can gain more by doing nothing than by doing something, then a player is incentivized to do nothing at all. It's kind of it's dangerous for players to adopt that because it incentivizes players not to interact with the game elements and encourages them to stay where they are rather than like propel them towards the conclusion or more interaction with the game. It's a quote kind of, it's a gameplay, the strategy that emphasizes heavy defense with little or no offense. Ostensibly, Turtle minimizes risk to the turtling players while baiting opponents to take risks to trying to overcome the defenses. The next kind of dynamic that could be kind of occur is king making. If players want to win the game, then a player's decisions should have the determining factor. Players should be able to figure out who wins based on, kind of effort and strategy and things like that. But one dynamic that works against the player being able to kind of win the game through their own hard work and smarts is this king making, where you might have like a player that has no chance to win starts kind of sabotaging other people to determine which of the other players will win. So it's kind of problematic because people get to decide or try to make certain other people win, rather than not. It's not yet, the win isn't decided by the winning player and their effort. It's more of the another player's sabotage of the other player. Button mashing, I know I'm guilty of this, is seen as a derogatory term in kind of circles of some games. If a button mashing player just kind of hits all the buttons at one time, hoping that, in a frenzied attack, their strategy will win because at least one of the buttons of the mashing has been hit right. But if someone randomly pressing buttons is able to win, then it's not exactly the best design of your controls. So if you make something so hard that only the experts win, and a regular button masher could also do just as well. I mean, I guess someone else is forced to button mash and they do just as well. It's yeah, like, why did you make the actions that you did if somebody that has no skill is able to do it as well? So another effort or a sample dynamic is grinding. I used to play Simpsons Tapped Out when I was bored on my phone, and it was essentially just tapping, and I was like, this is not fun. And so grinding is the idea that it's repeated play without meaningful decisions, and when players grind, they trade time or effort for in-game currency or experience points, and players end up playing for external motivations rather than like fun or satisfaction. So I was just trying to get these donuts when I was playing Tapped Out, and it wasn't fun, and I wasn't enjoying myself, and it wasn't. I just kept doing it because I wanted to win donuts and characters. So it's not a great strategy because your players aren't really engaged. They might be playing it, but there's no, like, they're not finding themselves having fun. I do kind of want to play it again though, so I can get more donuts, but I'm trying to keep myself away from my phone. And then pressure luck dynamics is between pressing for a higher reward or sticking with a safe payoff that plays out in many kinds of games. One of them occurs in football. If you're playing football and you get you get to the third down, and you only get kind of 4 tries to advance the ball 10 yards, and if you do so, you get 10 more yards. But on the last drive of the 4th down, teams are either faced with, punting the ball that gets the ball kind of in a different place on the field, or they can try to kind of keep going down to try to get this next 10 to make it to their yardage. So that was a bad description of that. I'm trying to read my notes and talk at the same time. But anyway, so you can either kind of, pressure luck is kind of, what advantage are you trying to get, or what dynamics are going to take advantage of? The one that you can get more yards and keep going to where you want, or kind of the one where you get rid of the ball and send it a different direction than the next team that will have the ball has. So it's also useful to differentiate between rules versus mechanics. It's a lot of times these the two kind of get collapsed onto each other, but it's important because a lot of times novice designers will kind of collapse the two, especially to differentiate. Mechanics are rules are what a player must do in order to participate in a game, and then mechanics are what a player does do. So rules kind of tell us what, like I guess the rules of the game, but mechanics are saying how we can do it, or like how can we deliver or like carry out those rules. A lot of times they're written down in the documentation, but yeah, the novice designers or designs often go heavy about the rules and what should be done versus kind of the mechanics on how this can be achieved. Castilla, or Drew Castilla, who also teaches the iteration of this course, argues that there's 3 different kinds of rules. One is constitutive, and these kind of like are like ideas of like what constitute the game, kind of fundamentally in a sort of way. These are the algorithmically prescribed rules, especially in these digital games. If you are positioned above an enemy and you're moving down and you make contact with them, the Goomba, or I forgot it, the little man in the case of Mario is eliminated. You destroy that target if you meet the conditions in order to eliminate the enemy. The second type of rule is an operational rule, and these are the rules that have to do with procedures of the games, like turn order, sequence of events, and that follow. If you do this, then you have to do this. So it's kind of like the orders or procedures that occur in a game. And then finally, there's implicit rules, and these aren't described in a documentation itself. And we're going to talk about documentation later on in another course, and it's not. There's lots of different forms of documentation, and you have to write kind of a book that talks about what your game is and how it works. And so these rules are not described, or implicit rules are not described in documentation, but they are expected or agreed upon by the participants in order to satisfy play. They might not explicitly present players in a cooperative side-scrolling shooter from shooting each other, but you can bet it's implied. So you don't necessarily, the rules aren't implicit, but again, it's more those, maybe a more social type rule that you're not supposed to do X if you're playing in this job or community. Maybe sometimes like a first-person shooter games that are kind of cooperative at times, that you don't want to go shoot the people that are on your team or you're being friendly with. It's not necessarily stated out in the rule book, but you kind of know that's not what you do. So our next question is, are you starting to understand maybe the often blurred distinctions between mechanics and dynamics? Again, these are just quick questions for me to see how everyone's doing. So yes, no, maybe, I don't know. So I look forward to seeing your answers. Our next discussion is aesthetics. Like we discussed last week, aesthetics relates back to gameplay, and the emphasis is that the game is kind of effective and makes some type of effect, emotional response to players. It looks at the way the game looks and feels and can be interacted with based on kind of all the elements of the game, and it overlaps with a lot of the terms that we talked about, and I kind of drew last week from the inspiration of aesthetics and fashion, but we also talk in terms of MDA, or I'm sorry, yeah, MDA, and which we're going to talk about just in a few more slides. So just to get a little bit more on the weeds of the aesthetics, and you can kind of see too like how it's designed kind of gives this emotional response. Pick emotional response. This is like Slime Rancher. It's kind of a first-person-y shooter in a way. It's more of a vacuum, I guess, where you get these slimes, but they're cute slimes, and then you take them, and then you can farm with them. So that's kind of one aesthetic, the way that it's approached and kind of a way that makes you feel. You also see the difference between kind of maybe a first-person shooter type game in 1980 versus one in 2019, and it kind of gives you a different impression. It leaves you different feeling a different way when you play a game. So aesthetics has to do with looks, but it also has to do with affective feelings, and that also is influenced by mechanics and dynamics, as we'll talk about. So there's also different ways to kind of see or experience the aesthetics. We can do it through visuals. We can do it through music, and we can also do it through themes that kind of pull together kind of the visuals, but also could be like, include the music, so kind of more unifying concepts in general. If we're talking about visuals, Shell in 2008 recommends us to not just see objects as an object, but to kind of start thinking about it, about things that we want to include in a video game, kind of more in terms of like maybe an artist might see idea or see objects. We want to linger and think of, what is the essence of a computer, so to speak. Don't just draw, two squares and a box for a monitor or something like that. Like if you're trying to prospectively draw. But anyway, you need to think of like what makes a computer kind of even more realistic, or what kind of style are you putting, like how are you portraying the visuals in a world. So you have to linger and think about what you're looking at. Got my Mario guy going. Visual design, might be easier if you already have a recognized brand. So if you're already in Spider-Man's world, that might be something that people can easily see. But how do you create these visual recognizable worlds that make people think a certain way or feel certain feelings? Shell also argues that concept art can pair with mechanics and dynamics of your game to really help you during the design process, and also kind of guides you. The images are so important in the design process, and I tell you that because when I'm looking at these week by week, I ask for visuals, and I want to see visuals because it helps make your idea clearer to everyone. Visuals are so key to the design process. It'll help you make your make it clear to your, if you're doing design, you can make it clear to your team. You can let people see, enter your own game world that you're trying to create, make people excited about your game, allow you to kind of get funding if you have like a proof of concept and people can see what you want to design. So you don't want to necessarily spend too much time like on a finished product of art, but maybe make a rapid prototype or something where people can get the idea of what you're trying to do a little bit better. Again, you want to create kind of like a balance when you're just starting out. Don't want to make it spend all your time on visuals because you do have to create the game as well. But anyway, music also lets you kind of, or audio for digital games, kind of sets the scene or influences you. I'm sure you all have a favorite piece of video game or digital game music. I had the Mario's going. I don't want to play it again because we've already heard it. But it's useful to also set the scene and create this kind of feeling in games. Theme also is important to aesthetics because a theme tells you what your game is about. Is it about the circus? Is it about like these are different slot themes. If like you were going to gambling, if you go to, I had a friend that when we would go to Las Vegas, she really wanted like the Wheel of Fortune, spinny wheel. What am I called? Yeah, why can't I think of the word? She wanted to play Wheel of Fortune slot machines. Such a hard term, I can't think of it. But so it was like a theme, or there's I think Golden Girls themed, or 1980s TV shows, or just a unifying concept that kind of pulls everything together. And themes are useful to kind of set the scene. And their themes are also useful because they reach every part of a work. Game's theme should unite its mechanics, it should unite its dynamics and aesthetics. Edgar Allan Poe called a theme a unity of effect, and or a sound kind of mirroring sense. It's like a thematic coherence. The game should kind of unite around kind of like one theme or one kind of idea that you're trying to relate. So hopefully that helps kind of just see aesthetics and why, like, visuals, music, theme, there's certain things that will help you pull pull ideas together and create feeling. Quick polling question for you all is, have you ever thought not just about the way a game looks, but also how the look and the kind of the gameplay or the game experience makes you feel? Is aesthetics something you've thought about before? I know sometimes it's difficult when I'm asking for students to kind of share their game ideas. It seems like visuals and the feeling that a game creates is usually like one thing that's left off. So is that something you've ever considered before? I feel like I'm on a YouTuber, like, let me know in the comments. But yeah, let me know. All right, so now we're going to kind of put these together, and I did have them together because mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, either board game or in person, there is some type of the coherence between the three of these topics. And again, we have kind of like a theorist that really, or two individuals that really kind of worked with the MDA theme and said, we can't just tell people to design games for fun. There's the rules, go make up the system, and that leads to fun. But that's not necessarily the most academic or research way to think about it. So we should, think of rules as mechanics. Although we've talked about how that doesn't necessarily equate, but system and dynamics, and then fun and aesthetics. You can kind of see the top-down paralleling counterparts is what they call it. And then another kind of reference or another source kind of thought that, kind of showed what those could look like. Mechanics or rules could be where you drop an item. The dynamics or behaviors of people could be where you trade or community behavior, and aesthetics could be where the player response could be learning some fellowship or something like that. So so yeah, there are lots of different kind of ways to approach this. And like I said, sometimes some terms I think are clearer than others, or some ways people describe these processors are clearer than others. But know that, aesthetics or rules and mechanics kind of contribute to dynamics in the system, and then fun and aesthetics are the feeling that people get from playing. And we're going to talk about flow and kind of engagement as well, and later on in this semester. So they also talk about how, the experiences that players have are often opposite. A designer thinks about mechanics first, then dynamics, and then aesthetics. But like when a player goes to play a game, they see those aesthetics first, they experience the dynamics, and then they, try to figure out the individual actions they can have. So it's kind of opposite. They're going the different ways as far as their interactions with MDA. So your quick polling question for this section is, does MDA focuses a lot on a larger system of game design to make sure that different game design and development parts are talking to each other? Just your own personal working habits, do you think you're a big picture type person, or do you prefer to focus more on the little details, or maybe a little mixture of both? Let me know in the comments. So the next thing we want to do is think about, like, who do the mechanics belong to, so to speak. Like, who are these characters in a game? Who travels through the space and acts as our surrogate? Who communicates the aesthetics, or who's involved in swept into the dynamics? How do you start thinking about characters when designing a game? Let's find out. I had to put my glasses on. My contacts were bothering me in the light. So just want to kind of say there's also characters, like when we're thinking about designing with characters, they really help us think about the design process in general. And Rogers kind of adds several different points that we can consider, or like that we might think of when we're using characters to help drive our games or design our games. First of all, we have personality and motivation. Think about your character's personality, and you kind of end up using that to help you design your game. If your character's motivation is kind of for success or revenge or love or acceptance, that whatever they're hoping for in their motivations and who they are as a character kind of helps you think about the actions that they have and maybe the goals that they're going to have. And it will kind of determine kind of what your characters will do or say. So, if you have Mario, who's courageous and bouncy and happy, he's a different character that's going to rescue the princess than maybe some sad, morose character that is, always angry or something like that. You have different gameplay. And, Sonic, we have this fast, cool, edgy thing, blue thing, hedgehog. He's a hedgehog, but from a different planet, I think. I don't know. So the who they are is going to help influence. Sonic's this fast, kind of happy guy, so it's going to be a different game, or like the characters do influence the gameplay and actions and goals that they have. So there's also this idea of personality tropes or stereotypes with characters, which I'm always leery of stereotypes because you want to be as original as possible, but other times, some games or expectations of a certain genre have typical characters. You might have this humorous character that says or does funny things or looks funny or has these really expressive kind of eyes and maybe cute or absurd. You might have a heroic character that does things like save the princess or is good at a weapon or skill or fighting battles. You might have a tough guy character that's kind of this hardcore guy that, might be a killer, or might be a guy that just chills out. He doesn't necessarily have to be nice, but he's always, extreme compared to other characters and maybe never loses their cool, always is cool. You might also think about visuals. The second picture here, brings out that shapes also often influence the way a character is, or vice versa. Personalities can influence the way you draw a character should reflect their personality, such as circles are typically tend to be friendlier characters, and squares are strong or dumb characters, and you have these downward triangles that are heroic or powerful, and might if they're the triangles like on their body, but if it's on their head, they might look like the sinister character, like the one that's pictured. Also think about silhouettes, especially at the early design stage. A silhouette can be a useful tool to help you, do a rapid prototype of a character without doing a lot of detail in the face. But you can see that a silhouette will give you a personality at a glance. It kind of distinguishes the character from one another. It can show friends or enemies. Can help show the body language between the characters. Colors might help, like differentiate characters or help reinforce characters. Red, white, and blue character might say, hey, I'm a patriotic character, or a villain might dress in dark colors, or, you can compare or contrast light and dark colors for certain characters, or, colorful colors for a happy character. Colors can really add to the character development. you also think of good names. You know, you have like character like Luke Skywalker and is, you know, celestial, and we have SpongeBob SquarePants, who, you know, is kind of a funny, silly kind of character. You just have to, the rule of thumb is to, your image has to match the name to fit what you see. These names can, you know, increase the connection to a player, and which also leads to the idea that customizing allows characters kind of the sense, or players a sense of ownership of their character, and you can spend hours letting players customize something. It doesn't mean all characters need to be customized, especially like licensed characters like Spider-Man, but you know, being able to customize like the name or the appearance, the clothing, the vehicles, the home base, the weapons, you know, all these things like make the character more real to a player, but always make sure that the customizing is doable technically. You don't want to give a developer a list of things that the character can custom or be customized and not be able to technically fulfill those. And you know, sometimes these decisions are meaningful enough to spend real money on them, so it's an interesting consideration of or how real these things are to people. It's also useful to think about when you're customizing a character to avoid the uncanny valley. You want players, you know, players are often looking for a projection of oneself, or, you know, finding like what or becoming a character, but, you know, if the characters are too realistic but not realistic enough, there's that kind of a balance between, you know, what people think are creepy. So avoid this uncanny valley, and also, you know, if their movements are very, and their appearance is very human-like, but they're supposed to be robots, you expect them to act like a human, but they act like a robot. So the movements and the appearance and who they are and what they say and do kind of has to be in a good balance, where people don't think that the characters are creepy. So there's more on characters, kind of, you know, maybe some best practices and just kind of other bits and pieces that are useful when we're thinking about characters when we're doing game design. First is that communication through characters. Characters are also not just, you know, the stars of the show, but they can also kind of bring in something meaningful to the game, and kind of make the game more real. You can have like movement and head turns and reaching. They can react to in-game events, and, you know, their health can be reflected in their movement. You know, if they get injured, you can slowly start moving, and their appearance can change, like their health, and you know, you can also make the stats part of their character design. You know, maybe they start flashing or something like that, or visual elements to show the state of a character, like bleeding, leaking. And you know, the inventory could be shown on a character, like their keys or a tool in their tool belt, or, you know, kind of showing what upgrades that they have or they could get. You know, their weapons could be on their bodies. You know, so just think about how you can communicate using characters, that can actually not just be, you know, that can make a character who's already important to the game even more important, I guess you could say. But also know that not all games have main characters. You can have, you know, often the character's you. If you know you're playing Tetris, you know, you become the main character. It's other times, you know, you can have like a character that stands in for you, like a guide character, like an MC or host. I know, like Trivial Pursuit, you can kind of have a host, but you don't ever see. I don't think you ever see them. But they can, or you can have the story as the character, where, you know, they're the like a kind of walking, you know, simulator type games advance the game by kind of putting the story together by exploring the environment. So you can kind of have the story be a character in itself, or the world and its character. You know, the world kind of changes and becomes something different. Like, you know, you're doing a city builder, the city is the world, and you know, you're kind of the god character that's, you know, doing the city, but then the city itself also becomes different based on the kind of actions you do, and it kind of becomes a character in itself. You know, also you can have multiple players, and kind of often they're complementary abilities. Sometimes you can play cooperatively. You can also have second playable characters where you aren't playing with someone else, but you're playing two characters. These aren't just necessarily companion characters, but they're also they because they're not controlled by AI, but you can also control them. I think of like the Lego Marvel games, like on that iOS or even little tablets and things. You can choose multiple characters, multiple playable characters, and you can um, actually have to play those characters because they have the complementary abilities where one can get into toxic waste and the other one can fly or something like that, like Batman and Robin. And you have to use both of them in order to fulfill your game objectives. You can also think about that there can be other characters that are kind of non-playable characters that are also useful in that they can give you directions on where to go, or you can interact with them, uh, kind of like townspeople, or just supplementary characters that you can also use. You could use these non-playable characters to kind of help or hinder you, and ultimately find ways to succeed. Sometimes you can these players can give you objectives, or you can help you access new locations where other objectives wait, or they help you travel to different locations. So these non-playable uh, characters can help you out. They can often be funny, or and don't have to be overly complex since you're not going to be playing them, but they can also help you contribute to the story in general. Um, also think about characters and the mechanics and physics. Like how short or tall are they? What is their relationship to others? You have to understand the dimensions of characters and what they look like to kind of get the look and feel right. Like, yeah, their height, or how big are they when they go through a hallway? What is their walking speed, running speed? How far do they jump? What's their height? How far is their melee attack? How far can they throw something? You have to think about, yeah, like the character and what their limitations and abilities are. Not just what they can do, but kind of think about how they walk, and even think about how they idle, and know that just walking is a very boring way for a character to get to one place to another. So maybe think about the different ways that you could do, and think about also realistic physics, and if you want to keep those or break them. Think of just jumping. A single jump might be a realistic physics, but we've also seen double jumps and triple jumps, and jumps where you can jump against walls and go up, that aren't necessarily something you see in physics, but it is a consideration for a player in a game. And then so overall best practices is make sure that your for characters in general is that make sure characters' actions and personalities can help determine their appearance. Give your characters distinct shapes or silhouettes or textures or colors. Have good names for your character. You can customize characters. Use the player to communicate other things in game. Think about the companions and second playable characters, and the ability to play multiple characters. But try to maximize, bringing in other characters, and having a use for those, and not just making it overly technically complex. So, and then also think about, yeah, like what's the way to make it exciting and engaging, in general. All right, so quick polling question on a scale of 1 to 10, how important are characters of a game? Like we're saying, they don't always have characters. You might be the character that does your Tetris game, but is that something that's important to you? Just want to know. Leave a message in the comments. The next element I want to talk about is a story. Stories can drive game design, but does the game need a story? Just like we asked with the character, does the game need a character? Does the game need a story? Let's weigh in and see what scholars say about that. So there's some people that take a pro story position, that you have to have a story to engage the player. and that games are in themselves artistic mediums for you to tell stories. So there are people that think that stories are very like you have to have a game, or a story has to have a game. Some anti-story positions say that, the story is something that takes place while you play the game, and, even games without stories become stories. So we don't need some overarching, strong narrative to pull the game along. The game itself is a story. Like if I think of like, oh, if you hit an instant replay of all your game time, you would be telling a story with all the moves that you made. So even without a story, so to speak, you could be telling a story with the actions that you took and the movements that you made. So just think about that when you're thinking of a story. But ways to tell a story in a game is like a game manual, which often isn't read. Exposition before, like, a game started, or cutscenes. Or if you think about like the process of transmedia storytelling, a lot of times, especially with established franchises, the story is already ongoing in progress. Spider-Man, what he's doing, because you read on other platforms or other media forms what Spider-Man is doing. So a game could be a part of this transmedia storytelling that's continuing on a story, and maybe it's told on other platforms, but it just happens to be like kind of made out through this through the gameplay. I just mentioned classical story frameworks. Storytelling in a game, to me, is just another form of digital storytelling. And if you look at any source, introductory source on game, or not game design, on storytelling, often Joseph Conrad's classics Hero's Journey pops up, and I teach game or digital storytelling, and that's one approach we do look at, just because it's so well known and popular. This idea that as a person, you get called to an adventure, kind of pass this threshold, you go through challenges, you go through this part that really tests you as a character, then you transform and kind of return back to the place where you started from. So that's kind of a well-known storytelling way, I guess, or way to tell stories, or kind of a process, or a model to tell a story. There obviously, that's not the only storytelling format. Other storytelling forms might have like 4 acts, like an introduction, development, you have a twist and a reconciliation, kind of have a repetitive pattern break structures where you do something and then you go back and do the same thing and do it again and do it again, and then at the end you have this surprising twist. But it's important to know that if you're telling a story, it's pretty much universal to understand that there's usually known as a beginning, middle, and end. The beginning, kind of sets the stage, talks about the character, talks about like what's going to happen, why, kind of gives the backstory. The middle, and does forecast into the future, like, if you're doing an essay, you came out of the same kind of structure. You have this thesis statement, this strong statement that tells you what's going to happen. So the beginning of a story, what kind of to expect in a way. Then you have the middle, which is kind of the actions of the story, and then the end is the conclusion of the story. So to make a story recognizable as a story, you need to have these kind of structures, this beginning, middle, and end. And designers often put a lot of thought at the beginning and the end, but kind of lose themselves along the way in the middle. That's kind of where players end up grinding. So make sure you also take attention to the middle of the story, so that players feel like the choices that they're making is meaningful and that you bond with them. And hopefully they care about the character when it dies, if it does die. Overall, you want to get a player to care about the character in a game. So that storytelling kind of happens to be one element that can do that. All right, so now I just kind of want to add a little bit about story bits too. Some best practices or ideas to think of when you're thinking about developing stories. First one is kind of Rogers draws inspiration from the production triangle, in which you get to pick 2 kind of elements. If you're trying to produce something, you can have quality, time and money on a triangle, but you can only choose two. You can't have quality time and money. You're going to have to suffer at one of those. Rogers also argues kind of in applying that general idea to like storytelling, you can only be weird in so many spots. So if you want, you have activities, characters, and a world. Only pick one of those. You don't want to have all three of those things be weird, so to speak. Examples of characters like the Wizard of Oz has weird characters, or they have ordinary desires like courage, love, and going home, albeit on a magical golden road. But the idea is that you're just going home. Kind of the characters are more weird than anything else. The worlds, Star Wars has like average characters like heroes, princesses, and a rogue, but and has familiar desires, but also exists in this crazy world. And also Monty Python has this, kind of regular characters in a regular world, but also really weird quests, like being killed by killer rabbits. So like it kind of shows that how, maybe only pick one weird element if you're going to write a story and want audiences to connect. He argues that Dune from 1984 was too weird because it had too many weird things and just audiences didn't get it or felt they didn't get it. That brings us to the second idea that think about audiences. There's audiences that care about stories in a game and want maybe this deeper experience about a game and what might take side quests and things, but there's also those that don't care about games and will press A or X or whatever they can to get through whatever story you're trying to tell as quick as possible. So make sure you think about your audience and know what they want and know what they're expecting. You should do some research on the audience you might think would want to play this game and think about what they want, depending on how much story you want to add and what type of story to add in and how you can do that. And also craft the story so it services the gameplay. So make sure it fits and it isn't just some extra thing that slows people down. Because again, time is one thing that that is useful to consider in a game, because people always want stories lively and moving, and anytime they have to slow down might make them disconnected from the video. And we'll talk about flow later and being able in this moment when you're playing a game. Also maybe think of surprises that it's nice to have unexpected or surprise elements to keep it as exciting, but don't make your story lack continuity or change the essence of a character. It's good to have some surprises in a story, but not too many where it just seems unbelievable or a character in particular. Also know that if you're doing like licensed property like Spider-Man or something like that, you're probably not going to be able to really dwell on or change the story too much. We have a set origin story for Spider-Man, and it often is, yes, told in a transmedia way across platforms. So we already kind of know what Spider-Man may or may not do in a situation. So also know that games don't always have to have strong storylines. Like Pac-Man or Tetris can still be engaging, and the narratives, like we know what's happening in the order that it goes in, kind of by the way that the game is laid out. So we still know what to do, but we don't have to be told like necessarily some backstory about a game. I know my brother really likes story games, and he'll like read everything that he possibly can. And I just try to skip through it because I like stories, but for some reason it's not in my games. And again, there could be a story that's being explicitly told through the game and the gameplay, but there's also the story that the player themselves is playing through their game experience. Like I said, if you hit a video walkthrough of the game that you played, then that's the story that you're trying to tell. Story and gameplay deviate. Again, just because you have a story to tell doesn't mean the character or the players are going to necessarily follow that. I know some quests I've done are like, oh, really encourage me on like a farming, like an island simulation scenario. They really want you to farm sustainably, but they also don't give you the materials that make that useful or like make that desirable, so I don't ever play like that sustainability. So the storyline says you want to be more sustainable, but I also don't play that way. So don't mistake story for gameplay and gameplay for story. So there could be you know, a thread that goes through about a story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to follow that and think that that's what the game ends up being. Um, Also, think about titles when you're doing stories. You know, you can have like a literal title or a cool title or puns or these purple cow titles where it doesn't really seem meaningful until you kind of find out a little bit more about the game. Dramatic titles, referential titles, just a lot of titles, considerations. You probably won't be titling a lot of games. You know, games take a long time to develop. You know, if they take 5 years to develop and you work in the industry, I don't know, say you work in there 10 years, that's only 2 titles that you and a team would probably have to come up with at most. Anyway, shorter the better and easy to remember, always useful. And overall best practices, you know, a story always has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Don't mistake story for gameplay. Almost anything can be made into gameplay, but create a world that characters want to play in and want to come back to. Um, and you know, keep names short and descriptive. Don't always think of your audience, and make sure that you know you stay true to a license if that's what kind of work you're doing. So here's our quick polling question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is the story for a game? We talked about characters, but what are your opinions on the story? Let me know. All right, so now we're going to kind of speed through this at the end. We're talking about goals. Goals kind of drive this action. So just let's touch on the basics if we don't spend too much time on everything, or dwelling on all the little points. If we're thinking about goals, there's several points to remember. You know, if goals are kind of things that drive the action, or I'll say that, you know, goals are objectives that a person or system desires to achieve. So the goal of the game is, you know, what is the character or the player trying to achieve. They relate back to rules, and that they are how and why a game is played, but they focus more on define emphasis on the motivations of the game, or like what does a character want to do, not like how do they do it necessarily, like rules might say, or what they can do, like mechanics might say. A goal game is what we strive for. Can be like the goals to kill a dragon or rescue a princess. They're also fundamental to games in that they determine what a player has to do to win a game, and like also give a player a sense of accomplishment and progression. They're traditionally quantifiable, so this is important, meaning that the goals are entities that can be measured, depending on which goal, kind of like which goals we're going to accomplish. So by making measurable goals, it's possible to tell when these goals have been reached. So the player, it's useful to tell the player when they've reached those goals through feedback. You can like do trophies or badges or unlocking new challenges, unlocking new levels, those kind of things. But it's really good to have those, because like the feedback that a player gets also keeps them motivated to play the game, and also reassures them that what they're doing is right, or that's going in the right direction. Um, you know, it's also interesting to think that, you know, you can turn anything into a game kind of based on goals. If I say that, you know, instead of just doing homework, you know, if I say, oh, we're going to have a race to finish our homework, let's see, whoever finishes first gets to choose what snacks we're going to have at the movies or something like that, if you have kids. So that's me. I've tried to turn everything into a game so that I don't end up frustrated. But anyway, so yeah, like goals are very important, and kind of like, you know, almost define games in a way at some points. They're also central kind of to the structure of a game, which means, you know, goals have to purposely guide the player through the game, and they're the focal point of a player's or a character or player's desire. It's also useful to not just have one goal, like this large strategy or large goal, but also kind of sub goals. You know, if again, if you want to give these players constant feedback of how good they're doing, or that they're reaching their goals, you have to have these sub goals that help them know that they're heading towards the right, they're doing the right thing to head toward the end goals. So It's important that you know, that we not only have like a main goal, but also these smaller goals. And it helps gradually lead the player to the eventual outcome that our game is trying to create, and also keep them motivated to keep doing that. And they goals can set the tone in a game and also be adjusted for behaviors, actions, or feelings. So if what am I trying to say? It sets a tone and drive the behaviors, because once you set a goal, then you can say, okay, how am I going to get the player or the character to reach this goal? Let's have them do X, or let's have them do Y. They're going to go through these series of actions. This is what the victory is going to look like. These are the weapons I'm going to give them. These are the choices I'm going to offer. So goals help set the players, or help set what you're going to do in a game, so that players know what they're going to do, and how they're doing it, and if they're doing it well, and drives their behaviors. So I kind of have this, like, you can see the badges sticker, or this dog. It's like, I'm from Duck Hunt. He used to laugh at you. I think that's bad feedback. So it's I mean, it was cute. I liked it when the dog laughed at me, I'll admit, because that was terrible. I think and then Nintendo came out, that with the Duck Hunt came out when I was like 4 or something like that. Anyway, I could have been 10. I don't know. I was a kid. I was a kid. Goal. So yeah. So anyway, in this game, I just thought it was interesting that it was like a Ninja Turtle game, and it was like the feedback you were going to get was that you touch this algae or whatever it is, and you would constantly get feedback. Old games like this scared me, because it was always like sudden death. It seemed like in a hardcore, and if you touch that, you would die. And how do you get past that? That's really hard, especially for a kid. Anyway, so just kind of points to remember about goals. And now I have a quick polling question for you. Some games, especially like video games, allow a player to not only play to progress an overall goal, but also explore and manipulate a world of its own meanings of playing. It's like a sandbox mode. How important are a game's goals to you? Do you only prefer to play a game in a mode that like makes progress to an overall goal? Or do you kind of spend time in the sandbox or creative mode if you can? Or you try a mixture of both? Is a sandbox a waste of time for you if you're just trying to play around, Minecraft on creative mode? Do you play creative mode because you kind of want to explore all that the world has to offer? Or are you more interested in kind of the overall goals of a game? Just kind of interesting questions that I'm hoping to find the answer for. Additional relevant terms, I'm not going to really go into much of this. This is just more for your perusal. And again, remember, key terms are at the back of or on the D2L site. So these, again, I'm just going to let you know that they're here, and you can download the PowerPoint if you want, but I'm not going to read them right now. They kind of do supplement this. But overall, we can start game design in various ways. Mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics can be one way. MDA as a technique together does offer a way into the game design process. We can think about characters, we can think about stories, we can think about goals, and overall think that game design is a multi-layered process that takes a team of people and doing a lot of prep work and a lot of iteration and a lot of review to get a game to be play tested and kind of even start to be play tested, and then the play testing will give us further information in order to refine and make our games better. So it's a long process, and it's an exciting process, and hopefully you all are going to find it exciting to at least think about designing your own games. Here's our references, and here's our closing. Thank you.